All right, so we're going to debate evolution and whether humans and chimps share a common ancestor. The reason this is a particularly important aspect of evolution because it's the aspect that Suboor has said is the thing that Islam is clear about didn't happen, and I think the evidence is clear that it did happen. So I'll just present a little bit of evidence. There's lots of it. We've got evidence from genetics, from paleontology, from archaeology, from biogeography, many fields of study. I'll just start with like one paper that's very important. It's this paper here. It was in Nature. It's the sequence of the chimpanzee genome, and it's done by the Chimpanzee Consortium, Genome Sequencing Consortium, and many of the world's leading genomic institutes signed off on this paper, and this is what they said. They said more than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley posited that humans share recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. So, you know, they don't usually have in science journals like quite such strong language. But the reason it's strong is because we really do have spectacular evidence for it. So let me give you just a couple of examples. So there are genes that get duplicated, and when they get duplicated, they can malfunction. They can lose their original function, shall we say. And these are called pseudogenes. And if you look at the chimp genome, there's many pseudogenes there. Just take one example. There's a pseudogene called Nano, and if you look at how many pseudogene copies they have, the chimpanzee genome has 10 pseudogenes of Nano. So if you like, these are like shared errors. So imagine someone hands you some homework, and then the teacher goes, "Hang on, I know that guy's older brother, and he handed in a very similar piece of homework 2 years ago." How would you know if you copied it? Well, if they had the same typos, you know, that would be very good evidence that it's been copied, or they'd have a same source. And this is what we're talking about here. They've got the same errors in the same locations. That's very hard to explain if evolution is not true, but if evolution is true, perfectly explained. Now, if you look, these are the nano pseudogenes. And if you look, let me just finish this point, okay, and then come back, okay? So you can see that they're in the same locations, same errors, but there's one nano pseudogene that humans have that chimps don't have. Okay, that is nano P8, not present in the chimpanzee genome. Now, if evolution is true, there's one way to explain that, and that is nano P8 must have become a pseudogene after we split with chimps. So now what we can do is use molecular clock technology, and we can see if that's true. If evolution is true, that must be true. So they looked for that, and this is what they said. Human nano P gene is located on human chromosome 15. It is the most recent of the nano-processed pseudogenes, exactly as evolution predicts, but evolution can make a more precise prediction. Because these pseudogenes, some of them are more than 100 million years old. They could be any age, really. But if evolution is true, nano P8 must be younger than the human-chimp split, and that's estimated to be about 6 million years ago. So we use molecular clock technology, and we see how old it is. If evolution is true, it must not be older than 6 million years. And here's the estimate. Here's the paper. It says it's between 0.9 and 2.5 million years old, just as evolution predicts. So we can go even further than that, because of that age. Now we know that age, we can say this: oh, they've now sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and we can say, well, once we've got that genome sequence, when did Neanderthals and humans split from each other? And that answer is between 400 and 700,000 years ago. So if that's true, then it must be the case that nano P8 is in the Neanderthal genome. And we don't know this a priori. It might be true, it might not be true, but if evolution is true, if humans and chimps share a common ancestor, we should find nano P8 in the Neanderthal genome. And here's the paper. As you can see, nano P8 is present in the Neanderthal genome. So that's one piece of evidence. We can go, I've got loads more, but I don't know if you want to respond to that.
So, the position which I'm defending today is that human chimp ancestry, it's been projected to the public like this is a fact, like this is true. And in the way that Phil just explained right now, that they have spectacular evidence that it's actually true. Now the case I'm going to be making is quite simple. It is that human chimp ancestry is not true literally. It is not a fact in the absolute sense, in the sense that it doesn't change and that it cannot be corrected due to future information. It is a scientific hypothesis which is based on a probabilistic framework which has assumptions, and there can be core disputes about it. Now, let's just go back to your first slide, because you said a lot of things, so I'm going to deal with each one at a time, right? So let's go back to your first slide.
Sure.
And the way we're going to do this is that once he makes a point, then I'm going to address those points, and then he can carry on make new points.
Okay,
go
that's
back.
Fine, yeah. There you go.
First slide.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
First slide. Your first slide.
Oh, okay.
Right. So, just give me that for a second. Sure. So the first thing that Phil did, and I think this is very important, is that he basically said this is the evidence for human chimp ancestry. He spoke about genetics, paleontology, archaeology, biogeography, right? Now these are different fields. Now the first point to make is any scientific conclusion in any scientific field can be revised based upon new information. So for example, you were mentioning about pseudogenes. Another piece of evidence which was used apart from pseudogenes was junk DNA. Junk DNA was used as evidence that we have natural selection responsible for leaving behind all this extra junk. Natural selection, the way it works is it's a very wasteful process. It's a process which punishes for, it rewards for a slight incremental advantage, and it punishes for something which is wasteful. Now, when it actually comes to junk DNA, we later on discovered that that wasn't actually junk. Much of it was actually functional. So if you want to point at something in genetics, whether it's pseudogenes or junk DNA or something else, the same principle applies. The problem of induction is a reason why we can't say that it's absolutely true. Now, about these particular fields, so whether it's genetics, biochemistry, linguistics, biogeography, anatomy, or the fossil record, each of these, when it comes to human chimp ancestry, this is still based upon homology. Now, homology is the assumption that similarities, whether at genetic or anatomical or biochemical level, are due to common ancestry. That is an assumption. Now, for someone to say that it is a fact, what they're basically doing is they're assuming that there is an argument to be made. Now, the argument which is actually put forward goes like this, and I want Phil to tell me whether he agrees with this argument. Similarities are due to common descent. Hey, look, similarities exist. Therefore, we have evidence of human chimp ancestry, or therefore we have evidence of homology being true. Do you agree with this argument?
No, of course not.
You don't?
No one in evolutionary biology thinks that, right? Okay. That's just ridiculous.
So you don't believe it's a fact?
No, I believe human chimp common ancestry is a fact, but it's not a fact just because humans and chimps are similar. No one is saying
that's fine.
Right? No one is saying because they're similar, therefore they have a common ancestor.
Sure. So in
fact, if you listen to what I said, we're actually looking at the dissimilarities as well as the similarities. Sure. There are subtle patterns between similarities and dissimilarities. So if you take nano-PA is not in the chimp genome, right? We don't. Right, so we're not just talking about similarities, we're talking about the dissimilarities as well. But there are consequences of the similarities and the dissimilarities. The way you assess this is the theory makes a number of precise predictions, and then using very parsimonious assumptions. Yep. Then, again and again, if you keep finding that the predictions are found by the evidence, then you say that theory is true, okay? Now,
wait,
you said, hang on, let me just come to what you said. Hang on, I want to address what you said.
Sure. I asked a particular question, which
Okay.
is, I summarized what you said there in an argument. I want you to tell me whether this argument is correct or it's incorrect.
Okay, if I understood what you said correct, then maybe I misunderstood you. But as I
Do you want me
understood...
to repeat the argument?
No. Okay, well, I'd say what I understood you to be saying. You were saying that it was based on an assumption of homology. Yeah? And that's false. That's not true at all. Okay? Let me tell
So
you why.
human chimpanzee is not based on homology.
It's not based on an assumption.
It's not based on the assumption of homology. Okay. So
It's based off of evidence.
Sure. So tell me this.
You don't start with the assumption of homology and then conclude homology. Of course not.
Okay,
Right?
so here's the thing. When you go out in the world and you look for a genetic similarity between humans and chimps,
Yeah.
or an anatomical similarity, or a similarity,
Or dissimilarity. We're talking...
whatever,
Yeah.
what are you basically looking for?
So we're looking for evidence of common descent.
Based on,
Based on the predictions that theory makes.
and what's the predictions?
Okay, I just gave some predictions.
Sure.
Right?
Which is homology.
Okay. No. Homology is the conclusion. It's not.
No.
it's
Homology is an assumption.
not- Okay. No, it isn't. Okay. Let me explain to you why it isn't. Okay. Right. Okay. Because we have some traits that are similar because of homology. Right. We also have some traits that are not due to homology. This is convergent evolution. Yeah, homophase is the linguistic term, but a more general term would be convergent evolution.
There's a difference between these two terms.
Okay, but the point is the same, right?
No, it's not.
How is it different?
Okay, so when you have convergent evolution, you are assuming that common ancestry is actually true, right?
Well, okay, I mean, yes.
So when it comes to the initial point which I made, which is that you begin off with an assumption, and that assumption is assumption of homology, and then you look for similarities or dissimilarities. You're saying homology is a conclusion. I'm saying homology is an assumption. Now,
Okay.
I'll give you evidence why it is actually an assumption and not a conclusion. Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's grandfather, he believed human chimp ancestry. He believed in it, okay? Now, what was his evidence for human chimp ancestry?
I wouldn't have thought he had any evidence of human chimp ancestry. I didn't know Erasmus said that. I mean, maybe he did, I don't know.
Okay.
I wouldn't have thought
Erasmus
he had
did.
much evidence.
Okay.
Fine.
Now, going back to the Enlightenment, and many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, just like Erasmus, they believed in human chimp ancestry to be true as well. And this goes all the way back, approximately 3,000 years, to the ancient Indian philosophers in the Indus Valley. All of these people, including the Greeks, the early Greeks as well, they believed in human chimp ancestry as well, human primate ancestry. This was based on the assumption of homology. Now what Darwin did is he came along and he put fuel on the fire by giving them a mechanism by which you can have transformation. So homology is an assumption, and for that assumption, for human, human chimp ancestry, for it to be taken as true, you need to have an argument. The best argument that you've given me so far, I've summarized, and you need to tell me whether you disagree with the premises or whether you disagree the premises leading to the conclusion.
Okay.
So let me repeat it for the benefit. One last thing. Let me repeat it for the benefit of the crowd here. Similarities are due to common ancestry. That's an assumption. Hey, look, similarities exist, whether it's a pseudogene, whether it's something in genetics, whether it's something in linguistics, or whatever. Therefore, common ancestry is true. I want you to tell me, do you disagree with the premises or the conclusion?
Okay, what I would say is I disagree with your premises. Okay, you don't start. I mean, there may have been people that thought. Hang on, let me finish.
Sure.
You spoke and I didn't
Sorry.
interrupt you. Okay, right. So it's certainly true. There are people that thought human chimp common ancestry were true before we have the evidence. That's true. Okay, but when you go and do the genetic tests, right? When you do the genetic test, you don't know what the answer is. The genetic tests give you an answer though. Okay, so you can go in there, doing that experiment, you can do that experiment without any presupposition about whether human and chimps have a common ancestor or whether they don't. So if you take the example that I gave, notice that Suboor did not really counter any of the evidence that I actually presented. Hang on, please say this one. Right? Okay. I said if evolution is true, then we should find that nano P8 is the youngest of all the nano pseudogenes. Okay. but homology doesn't tell you which of those nanogenes are the youngest, does it?
Yeah, but you're using homology.
But it doesn't tell you which are the youngest. It doesn't tell you a date.
Look,
does it?
Phil, you're making an argument which is that genetics has given us something new.
It's not me giving the argument. This is what all of the people on the Chimpanzee Genome Consortium say. Okay, don't make this about me, right? Okay,
this is your interpretation of what they're saying.
Okay, well, it's damn clear what they said. Spectacularly.
So Phil, tell me this.
Spectacularly confirmed.
Sure. So
that's what they said.
Okay. That's not what they
right?
said.
Now, hang on. Here's what they said. I'm sorry. I'll pull it back up just so you can. You tell me what they. You read that out. Hang on. Read that out, where it's more than a century ago.
What paper is this?
This is, I told you, initial sequence of the chimpanzee genome in comparison with the
what
human
is that?
genome.
What is that? Comparison, which is homology.
Yeah, but you're comparing to see whether homology is true or not. And the data could come back not, couldn't it?
Yeah, but hang on.
Right, is it true or false that the data could come back and say not homology?
You put the cart before the horse. Let me explain. Let me just explain what's going on here. When you go out and look in the world, there's no such thing as looking at scientific evidence, observations, and then coming up with a hypothesis. That doesn't exist. You don't go out in the world, look for observations, and come up with a scientific hypothesis. No. What you do is you start off with a hypothesis, and then you go out and look for evidence.
It goes both ways, but that's beside the point. I can give you examples.
Darwin himself, what he basically said is this. He said if science doesn't proceed by beginning off with a hypothesis and then looking for evidence, then you might as well go to a quarry and count pebbles. Now this issue is a well understood problem in the philosophy of science, that you have the theory ladenness of observation because of this issue. Now, when you are doing a study like this and you say we've come to a conclusion, that conclusion starts off with an assumption, as it does in the title of the paper, which is the assumption of homology, comparison.
That's not in the title of the paper at all, that's false.
Comparison.
They're comparing. So
comparing what are they comparing? Me and the tree, or they're comparing humans and chimps? Which is homology.
No.
That's not homology?
No, it isn't. Because homology is, okay, let's explain, to those people that aren't familiar, right? Homology is defined, well, the definition of homology has changed over time, okay? So before it was just similarity, okay? Now we think it's similarity due to common descent. That's how the homology is generally understood.
No, that's not quite true.
Let me finish, right? Okay? But this is the important point. The important
point... Every
point's
important.
No, because some are trivial, right? Some less trivial, okay? Right, so the point is, there's nothing in the title of the paper that says anything about homology.
What?
Okay?
Read the title again.
Initial sequence of the chimpanzee genome and comparison with the human genome.
Comparison of genomes is homology.
Okay, no, it's not. I'll tell you, I'll explain why. If they're homologous, then we look to see, take the example I gave. We look to see if they're homologous, then nano pH should be the youngest of the pseudogenes. Yep. We don't know that ahead of time. Yep. We do molecular clock data, and then we see, is it homologous or is it not homologous? Okay? It's not decided ahead of time.
Yeah, now, the assumption is there though.
Okay, yes, the assumption is there. I don't disagree with that.
And that assumption is there. So you previously said it's a conclusion on assumption.
No, what I'm saying is, you're misconstruing what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you don't just derive homology from an assumption of homology. What I said was,
that doesn't make any sense.
What I said is that you derive common ancestry from the evidence, not from the assumption of common ancestry. Okay, I'm not saying no one ever assumed there was common ancestry. Obviously they did.
Let's delve down to genetics.
Okay.
Do you think genetics gives evidence for human chimp ancestry to be true literally?
Well, it depends what you mean by true literally.
Forget that. Do you think it's evidence?
Yes, of course.
Apart from homology.
It's spectacularly.
Okay, so tell me this. Is that anything apart from homology? Is genetics, has it taught us anything apart from homology?
Well, of course, genetics has lots of it.
In terms of human chimp ancestry?
In terms of human chimp ancestry, what it's taught us is that humans and chimps share a common ancestry.
No, that's right. Incorrect. Let me give you evidence.
No, it's not.
Let me give you evidence.
That is exactly what all the people in the field say, and that's what the evidence points to.
That's not actually true. Let me give you evidence.
Okay.
This is the same problem that Aaron Ra came up with, right? He thought genetics was something different to homology, right? Like it brought something new in. But you have to put it this way: a scientist walks into a lab. He walks in with a certain assumptions. One of the assumptions is that of homology. That is a given assumption before you even enter the lab, right? Now that assumption does not change because of something you observe. It is still an assumption.
Yeah, but you can invalidate the assumption via observations. If NanoPA was not the youngest of the pseudogenes, right, that would be evidence against the assumption of common ancestry, would it not?
No.
You agree or disagree?
Let me
Answer that. Do you agree or disagree?
What day of the week is it? Yes or no? Let me break down your question.
No. I've asked you a very serious question. If it turned out that NanoPA was not the youngest of the pseudogenes, if it was 100 million years old, that would be very strong evidence against human common ancestry, would it not?
No, it wouldn't.
Why not?
I'll tell you why.
Right, tell me
because homology, the idea that humans they did not come in the history of the world by themselves, de novo. They are linked to something else, primates or whatever. This is a basic assumption in science, and there is no piece of evidence that can go against it.
How is that? How would that be? How would that not be evidence against it? You haven't explained anything. You've just stated.
No. Let me explain why.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is linked to my previous point, which I was about to make about genetics. So science begins off with methodological naturalism, which is the idea that anything that we look at, we are going to assume there is a natural explanation for it. So when you look at me and you, a blade of grass or Lady Gaga, they're going to assume we're going to have a naturalistic explanation for this. Correct? Do you agree with me so far?
I think the answer to that's complicated, so you carry on.
Okay, but I'm going to make a blanket statement, you can challenge it afterwards, which is,
Okay, go on.
that is the very crux of the scientific method, methodological naturalism. So, methodological naturalism means that anything a scientist or evolutionary biologist studies, they're going to assume that they have a natural explanation. Because of that, human beings and chimpanzees, or human beings or something, if chimpanzees or primates didn't exist, right? If something else existed, which was, I don't know, whatever, pigs, whatever, right? We would always be linked to something which is non-human, simply because of that assumption of methodological naturalism. So there is no piece of evidence which can go against that foundational assumption of science. Now let me, okay, fine, that's fine. Let me make one more point, which is this. You're saying genetics has added something new, which is exactly what Aaron Ra was saying, which is why I'm disagreeing with both of you at the moment. Genetics, all it tells you is that you have this particular field, just like all the rest of the fields, in which you have an assumption of homology. That's all you actually have. Now, let me give you some evidence for this. Jonathan Marks, he's the atheist evolutionary biologist, and you can check this out yourself. He believes human chimpanzee history is true. He's an atheist. So for him, foundationally, human beings have to be linked to something else in life. Yet he, in his book, which is published by Oxford University, called Evolutionary Anthropology: A New Introduction, right, an alternative introduction, he says about homology. He says, what has genetics actually taught us from the time of Linnaeus, which is prior Darwin, in terms of genetics? He says absolutely nothing. It can give us new information, but it doesn't change the foundational assumption of homology. Homology is an assumption, and genetics doesn't make it into a conclusion. It is still an assumption, and it will remain an assumption whether you bring out your evidence from genetics or anatomy or biochemistry or the fossil record or linguistics.
Okay, so let me respond. I think what Suboor is saying is completely and utterly false. We don't have to assume on naturalism that humans are related to chimps, and I'll explain why. Because there was a popular belief, goes back to the ancient Greeks, I think it was Anaxagoras that came up with it, and it was only disproved, actually same year I think as the origin, I think it was 1859, right, called spontaneous creation. Aristotle believed in this, okay, and it was popular up until the 19th century, where it was considered that species spontaneously were created, you know, out of non-living matter, right? So on that, now that can be a perfectly naturalistic scenario, okay? You don't have to believe in God to believe in separate creation. You could have a naturalistic separate creation for all the different species, okay? So there's nothing at all about naturalism that forces you into a conclusion that humans and chimps have to be related. They don't have to be related.
Why?
Let me finish. Sure. They don't have to be related based off of naturalism. Okay, so naturalism doesn't force you into that conclusion. But what forces you into the conclusion is the evidence. Okay, that evidence. Now notice that Suboor has not really said any specific problem with the evidence other than a general criticism is based off of naturalism. But as we've seen,
I said naturalism and then homology.
Okay, but again, you don't have to assume from the outset. You can do a test. The test will tell you. You could say, I start off with the assumption humans and chimps are not related, and then I will look at. You could do that.
Okay, so tell me.
You don't have to assume that.
So tell me this.
In fact, just to show you how wrong you are, when the first people started looking for hominid fossils, right? They didn't necessarily assume it was with chimps. Okay, some people thought that the orangutan was the closest, right? And so now, of course, I accept that would be a naturalistic,
and that's homology too.
But my point is, the evidence can check whatever your assumption you start with, right? The evidence can then update what you start with, right? So the evidence could contradict your belief that humans and chimps share a common ancestry. It could easily do so.
You made 2-3 points I need to address.
Okay.
So you admit that it does start off with an assumption.
Okay, what I'm saying
previously
is,
you didn't do that.
No, okay. What I'm saying is, you don't have to start with any assumption.
That's fine, but you just admitted right now that you do start with an assumption of homology.
Okay. When you say you, what do you mean by you?
As an evolutionary biologist or a naturalist or somebody that's looking at this, you start off with the assumption of homology.
Okay. If you're an evolutionary biologist, then you will believe in homology.
Fantastic.
However,
and would you start off with it?
If you start, okay, it depends what you mean, right?
Okay.
Let me finish. Let me answer that point. You don't have to start off with this. If you're an evolutionary biologist, you don't have to start with the assumption that humans and chimps share a most recent common ancestor.
Okay.
We do agree with that?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't agree with it.
Why
Because
not?
the first, you made 2-3 points.
And also, as a naturalist, you don't have to even believe in evolution.
Okay, but you've said 2-3 points which are unrelated, so I need to dissect each one. Okay. So firstly, when you said, as a scientist, you don't need to start off with methodological naturalism, that's okay.
No, I didn't say that. What I said was, if you believe in naturalism, you don't have to believe in evolution. You could believe in spontaneous creation.
That's not the point I made, though. That's a red herring.
The point you made is because what you said was that if you're a naturalist, if you start with methodological naturalism, you have to believe that we have some kind of common ancestry with other animals. That's what you said, and that statement is false.
Because you're making a few points, I'm going to have to take notes.
That's fine.
Sorry.
Notes.
Yeah,
That's
go on.
fine. Okay. So my point was, you said that as long as you're a naturalist, you have to believe that we share common ancestry with other animals. That you have to believe that.
Yeah.
Right. And that's false.
You have to believe.
You have to
believe in some naturalistic beginning of a human being, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be with common ancestry with other apes, does it?
Yeah,
it
but
doesn't have to have common ancestry with chimps. So
yeah,
you don't have to have any of that.
But that's the most popular view.
Because the evidence has directed us that way. It wasn't always the most popular view.
Okay, so two points here. So, what would you say about somebody who says that all you need in terms of evidence, all you need in terms of a beginning is just the first sort of spark, the first sort of luck, and from that you can explain a purely naturalistic story of all human beings basically having a common ancestor, right? What do you think of that idea?
Well, you need to each idea needs to be backed up with evidence.
Sure.
Right?
Okay, now.
And in terms of human-chimp common ancestry, we have overwhelming evidence for that. We have multiple independent lines of evidence. And let me just
that's all based on the assumption of homology. That's the point I'm making.
No, that's the whole point. You say it's based off the assumption of homology, and that is just completely and utterly false. Okay. Right? Now, that's not to say that people don't have assumptions of homology, but the evidence, the tests, they are not based off an assumption of homology. They are independent of what you start off with your assumptions. You could assume, if you went into that lab and assumed that human and chimps were not sharing common ancestors, Can you have my watch?
Glasses. I'm going to demonstrate a point.
Okay.
Okay. Do you mind if I wear them? Okay. Let me just wear your glasses for a second. I want you to tell me something, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wearing your glasses right now.
Yeah.
Since I'm wearing your glasses,
Yeah.
am I affected by the lens?
Yeah, I would have thought so. Yeah.
And wherever I go, is this lens going to be all-encompassing in terms of what I see?
Well, it depends what you mean by see. If you mean visually, because people use seeing as perception, right?
Yeah.
It just in terms
Which
of
is
what
what
you
it
see.
is.
No, but hearing is perception. You know, there's a touch is perception. So in terms of your visual outlook, of course, it's going through the lens. Yes, of course.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
Good. Now, as a scientist, the point which I'm making is, whatever field you look at, whether you are a biochemist, a geneticist, an anatomist, linguist, an evolutionary psychologist, you have the assumption of methodological naturalism and the assumption of homology. And that assumption is not something you can put aside and look at the evidence independently, because that's not the way that science works. That's the point I was making.
Okay. Can I respond? Right. Okay. So you can. The whole point is you can test your assumptions, right? You can collect data and see if your assumptions are correct or incorrect. So again, if you look at the genetic data and you say, okay, if evolution is true, nano P8 must be the youngest of all the pseudogenes. Now that data comes back to you
Okay,
and gives you an answer, and it doesn't depend on what you started with.
Okay, fine,
Okay?
fine.
You'll have to explain how it is. Is it just coincidence that nano P8 is the youngest pseudogene? Tell me why. Why, if evolution is not true, why is it? Why is it that we share the same mistakes in the same location, and then with the one that we don't have happens to be dated before the split, just like evolution would predict? Tell me how that happens.
Let's do some counterfactuals, so you understand my point.
Okay.
If they make an assumption that something is going to be there and it is there, or if something's going to be there and it's not there, it doesn't make a difference to the assumption of homology, and it doesn't make a difference to the overall epistemic weighing of human chimpanzee history. That's the point I was making. I'll give you some evidence for this.
Okay.
So, we and chimps are supposed to have a recent common ancestor. So, why is it that if somebody was to use the assumption of homology and then go ahead, why is it that the closest to us in human behavior is not actually the chimpanzee, is actually the ant? Ants have warfare, ants have economics, ants have actually battles.
Chimps also have warfare.
Hang on, one second.
Let him finish his point.
Sociologically, according to evolutionary biologists, the closest thing to human beings is actually the ant. And there's a book on this, E.O. Wilson's The Social Conquest of the Earth, right? And there's other atheist evolutionary biologists who've admitted the closest to the human being in terms of our social capabilities is the ant. The closest to human beings in terms of our intellectual capabilities is actually the crow, right? Now, those observations which go against the sort of a priori sort of, before looking at the evidence, if someone was to assume if homology is true, then this would be true. Those haven't changed at all the epistemic weighing of human chimpanzee history, those dissimilarities. Why haven't they? Because the assumption that you begin with is always going to remain an assumption, and the similarities that you see, you're going to say are due to common ancestry. The dissimilarities you're going to say are due to homoplasy. There is no piece of evidence that can undermine that.
Okay, all right. So first off, the statement that humans and ants are the most similar.
Sociologically.
All you said was that because they have. Let me just say, what was the evidence for that? They have warfare.
Okay, let me give you some.
So one at a time. One that was warfare, correct?
Okay,
correct.
I gave
chimps also have warfare. So that seems like pretty weak evidence to me. What was the next one?
Okay, one second. So let me explain how sociology works. I think you've made a misrepresentation here. Of course, they both have warfare.
Right.
Except in ant colonies, and this isn't according to me, this is according to the evolutionary biologists who study this. In ant colonies, you have massive warfare where millions of ants go out and they fight. And not only do they go out and fight, you actually have ants which go out and apply medicine to the ants which are actually injured. Now, the complex level of warfare that ants have is totally different to to chimp warfare. Now, when it comes to human and chimp being similar in terms of the sociological behavior, and humans and ants actually being closer than humans and chimps, this is not something I've said. This is something evolutionary biologists have come to the conclusion of. And of course, those conclusions can be revised based on new data, but that's the conclusion that they've actually come to. Now, Henry Gee, he's a atheist evolutionary biologist.
He's not an atheist, you're wrong.
He is an atheist.
No, he isn't. I've got a quote from you directly.
Okay.
You're wrong.
He is an atheist evolutionary
No,
biologist.
he
He's based
isn't.
here. Okay, we
You're
can deal
wrong.
with whether he's an atheist or not later.
Okay.
Let's deal with his point
Okay,
here.
fine,
His
fine.
point here is this.
Yeah.
In his book, An Accidental Species, talking
Yeah.
about us,
Yeah.
he writes in that book that humans and ants are the closest sociologically. And he's the senior editor of Nature.
No, he isn't.
He's not the senior editor of Nature?
No.
Henry Gee?
Correct.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. Because Nature doesn't have a senior editor. It has a whole bunch of senior editors. Okay? And you're misquoting him. Let me give you a quote from Henry Gee. Okay?
Wait, hang on a second.
Okay.
What about the point I just made?
Okay, I'll respond. Let me respond. Okay? Let me respond. Okay, first off.
You've been jumping around a lot.
Okay, well, so are you, right? Okay.
No, I refute your points and jump on. You jump on without being
You haven't
without addressing
refuted
my points.
anything, Suboor. You haven't refuted
Can I wear your
anything.
glasses again? Because until
Okay.
you
No,
show me
okay.
homology, until you
Okay,
until
let me
un-
respond.
un-
Suboor,
un-
let me respond. You can
there
wear
you
it. Right, okay. Okay.
So these are the assumptions of homology, and once he shows me that scientists don't have this assumption, I'll take them off.
Okay, first off.
You don't need your help.
Okay. All right, okay. First
I
off.
don't need your help.
So first off,
God as my help.
Suboor's wrong about Henry Gee being an atheist.
Henry Gee.
Henry Gee, sorry. This is a direct quote from him. I am with the scientists of an earlier age who found that their motivation in advancing the cause of knowledge was to magnify the name of the Creator. Okay? So that was in Nature, that was his own words, right? He also says, right, he never disputes that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. He agrees with that.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
I never said he doesn't.
Right, and he also agrees that the fossil evidence supports evolution. Agreed?
Based on the assumption of homology.
No, it's not based on the assumptions of homology. It is based off of the evidence that we actually
Can I
have.
see
Let's
your
just
quote?
go. All right, hang on.
Can I see that quote?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. You can. There's the source. Check it.
Doesn't necessarily prove he was a theist.
No, agreed. It was 1 point at a time, right? 1 point at a
In
time.
another place, he said
Right.
he's an atheist,
Well, that's what I have. I mean,
and that is not clear. That's not clear.
Give me your quote that says he's an atheist.
But I don't have it with me right now.
Well,
but listen,
that is
you haven't-
why. That is why. I
Well, you want me
wanted
to
do-
memorize every single
No,
person?
so
and why
what
they
I
didn't?
suggested, the debate that we had, what I suggested the debate we did initially was that we would swap our statements ahead of time, because then we can check who's misquoting and who's
Okay,
not
but
misquoting.
him being an
and
atheist.
you didn't want to do that.
Wait, hang on a second.
You didn't want to do that because you said it would be boring.
Wait,
right?
hang on. Well, Phil, look. Whether Henry Gee is an atheist or he's not an atheist,
Okay,
how
fine.
on earth does that change our conversation?
No, I'm just saying. No, agree. I'm coming to the next point. Right. The point is,
You need to
Henry
address
Gee.
these glasses.
Okay, Henry Gee, right, agrees that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. He agrees that the fossil
Based on
evidence...
homology.
No, where does he say it's based off homology? He says it's based off of the evidence.
If you look at Henry Gee
Yeah.
and all of evolutionary biologists, including philosophers of biology, they all have said the same thing, which
Like
is
who?
that we have the assumption of homology
Really?
in our field. And this isn't just about one guy said this or another guy said this. Look, I want you to tell me something, right? If there is a book which is published by, say, a reputable publisher,
Yeah.
which has an atheist philosopher of science or an atheist evolutionary biologist who says a particular thing, and then you come here and you say something else different, then should I go with what I have in front of me or should I go with what you have?
You should go with the evidence. That's what you should go.
And the evidence is that when
okay,
he...
this is a quote from Henry Gee. Let me read it out to you, okay? They had the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. And Henry Gee organised, he wrote this, about they had this thing to celebrate that in Nature, okay? And this is what Henry Gee said. The articles in this insight testify to the success of Charles Darwin's theory of descent with modification by means of natural selection, carefully detailed in his book On the Origin of Species almost 100 years ago. Its simplicity. Given heritable variation, the superabundance of offspring, and environmental change, natural selection must happen and evolution will follow. So he says the assumptions are genetic heritability and variation,
Yeah.
superabundance of offspring,
Yeah.
and environmental change. That's it. That's the three things that he says. He
In
never
that
says
way.
based off the assumption of homology.
So?
He says based off those three assumptions.
Wait,
All
hang
right?
on a second.
And also he says this. Let me give you one more quote from Henry Gee. Darwin would have been safe. Darwin would have been safe. Okay, hang on. Darwin would have been safe had no fossils ever been discovered. It remains the case, however, that fossils provide direct evidence of evolutionary change in our past.
So where does it say he doesn't have the assumption of homology?
Well, where does it? Where he says that natural selection, evolution follows from three things: heritable variation, selection, superabundance of offspring, and environmental change.
Okay, now what you've
Right?
done is you've actually committed a fallacy now.
Go on.
You've committed the fallacy of equivocation. We are speaking about homology and he's speaking about natural selection. Now, homology is a necessary condition for human-chimp ancestry to be true, but it's not a sufficient condition. For it to be sufficient, you need a mechanism. And a mechanism, in terms of science, can never be proven because of the inductive nature of science. Now, what you've done there is you've said he is assuming these things, but those are the assumptions of natural selection. Now, Henry Gee and any other evolutionary biologist in the world, they do actually believe in the assumption of homology, and they also, prior to that, have the assumption of methodological naturalism. Now, Elliot Sober, who is an atheist, again, evolutionary biologist, if you don't dispute he's an atheist, we can deal with that too. He's an atheist evolutionary biologist. In his book, Evidence and Evolution, which is published by by Cambridge University, he says, the idea that humans and chimps must share a common ancestor because they're so similar, and humans and mushrooms must have independent ancestry because they're so different, they're both naive. Because within a probabilistic framework, there is no must. And he goes on in that same very book, speaking about homology, homoplasy, and the ad hoc rationalizations which do actually exist in the field of evolutionary biology.
You're always quoting Elliot Sober.
Wait, hang on one second. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to show me that scientists don't begin off with the assumption of homology. Don't take a word of a scientist out of context. I want you to show me as a field they don't begin off with the assumption of homology. And two, I want you to show me how it's possible to have a conversation about homology without speaking about the mechanism, because if you can show all the similarities between humans and chimps, humans and pigs, humans and whatever, if there is no mechanism of transformation, all you have is a story. Which is why, and this is the last point I'm going to make, you can try and refute all these points, human-chimp ancestry was something which the ancient Greeks believed in, the ancient Hindus believed in, the Enlightenment Victorian thinkers also believed in, including Darwin and his grandfather. The reason why this idea took off is because Darwin gave a mechanism, the mechanism of natural selection. If the mechanism breaks, or if the mechanism is shown to be insufficient, you cannot claim human-chimp ancestry is true.
Okay.
Because without the mechanism, it's like you have a bridge and you have two foundations, the foundations break and you want to cross the bridge. You cannot. Darwin's theory is not a theory about similarity, it's a theory about natural selection leading A to Z.
Okay, all right, so what Suboor did was totally and utterly misquote Elliot Sober. Okay, so what he said was true, that Elliot Sober says you can't just look at similarities and then derive common ancestry. That's naive, and I agree with that. I agree with that right from the start, right? But what Elliot Sober goes on to say, don't interrupt, what he goes on to say was, and this is a direct quote, you can look this up in that very book, the torpedo shape found in sharks and dolphins does not provide strong evidence for their having common ancestor. Natural selection favours this shape in large aquatic predators, so we'd expect it to be present in modern sharks and dolphins, regardless of whether they have a common ancestor. In contrast, The gill slits found on human embryos and in many fish are evidence of a common ancestor precisely because they have no adaptive utility in human embryos. The term vestigial carries the double meaning that Darwin intended. Vestigial traits are useless to the organism and they are vestiges of a bygone age. By recognizing they are useless, we see they provide substantial information about the past. Now this is the point. It's true that you can't just look at similarities and then say, right, that's down to common ancestry, that's homology. You have to do things that are more sophisticated than that. Let me give you another piece of evidence to show you how this is done, okay? So let me go back to my little presentation here, okay? So, let's go to something called amino acid functional redundancy.
Hang on.
No.
Let's stick to Elliot Sober's point. Because I don't want you to make a point and move on.
No, but it's important.
Wait, that's a separate point.
Hang on. This isn't related.
Listen, I'm here all day. Let's deal with that point. How does that undermine...
I'm not here all day.
Well, I am.
Okay.
So how does that undermine the point which I made about him?
Because you misquoted Elliot Sober.
How?
You misquoted him because
How?
what Elliot Sober said was you can't just look at similarities and then say, okay, that's down to common ancestry. And I agree with that. But what he said afterwards was that if you look at similarities in functional things, that might be down to common ancestry, might not be. But if you look at similarities in non-functional things, then you can conclude common ancestry. That's what Elliot Sober says. Elliot Sober is very clear. You can conclude common ancestry.
Hang on
and you're quoting him to say that you can't.
It's a really strange situation where somebody says you are misquoting this person, and then when they are explaining how you're misquoting that person, they misquote them themselves.
How did I misquote him?
Here's exactly what Elliot Sober said. He said, the idea that humans and chimpanzees have a common ancestor, the idea that they must have a common ancestor because they're so similar, and the idea that humans and mushrooms must have independent ancestry because they're so different, both of these are naive because they are based on a probabilistic framework, and within a probabilistic framework there is no must in either case. He is describing homology as an assumption, and that assumption of homology fits into a probabilistic framework which also has other assumptions such as a mechanism of natural selection, which also has other assumptions such as gradualism and vertical gene transfer and so on and so on. So what I said there, he did not undermine but what he's describing later. Elliot Sober, what he's basically saying is that you cannot claim human-chimp ancestry is true, literally is a must, because it's still based on a probabilistic framework, which is exactly what I was saying.
Okay, let me respond, right? What Sober is saying is that you can't just look at the similarities and conclude common ancestry. I totally agree with that. No one is doing that. Let me show you how we do this, okay? Here's another piece of evidence, okay? This is called amino acid functional redundancy. So if you look at amino acid sequences, right, you can have different amino acid sequences give you the same functional protein. It's a bit like, imagine if you get dealt some cards, right? Imagine you get dealt 4 aces. Okay, I've got a strong hand here, right? It doesn't matter what order the aces are in, does it? It doesn't matter whether you've got the ace of diamonds first or the ace of spades, it makes no difference, right? So similarly, in proteins, you can have different sequences of amino acids give you the same functional protein, okay? So there are proteins called ubiquitous proteins that are shared throughout all living things. So an example is something called cytochrome C, okay? So in cytochrome C, you can have different amino acids and they will have the same function. How do we know this? Because genetic engineers have actually taken the cytochrome C of humans, which has a different amino acid sequence, put it in yeast and found it works just as well, okay? So there's no reason for the amino acid sequence to be the same unless I have common ancestry. So here is a table comparing amino acid sequences, right, of different species. And what you see is that the humans and chimps, the amino acid sequence of cytochrome C is absolutely identical. Not a single difference. Hang on, if you can just not stand in front of the camera. Yeah? Now, as you go to other species, other mammals, they're pretty similar, but not identical. And what evolution would predict is they get less and less similar as you go to less and less related species. So if you go to yeast, you see very little similarity. Hang on, let me finish. Let me finish, right? Now, the point, and it's the point that Elliot Soper himself makes, is that if you look at something that's functional, if you just looked at, oh, are the proteins similar? Yes, you cannot derive common ancestry for that because they're functional. But the amino acid sequence is not functional. You can have a huge number of amino acid sequences, right? Now, what's the problem? Now, Suboor says it's based on probabilistic reasoning. That is not even a serious objection because you have to say, what are the probabilities, right? I mean, if you say this thing has 1 in 2 chance and this thing has 1 in a zillion chance, they're not the same, right?
Okay.
Let me finish the point. Right, so what is the probability? This was done, they calculated the probability of this pattern happening if evolution is not true. And what they said was, the probability of that happening if evolution is not true is 1 times 10 to the power 93. So when he says it's based off probabilistic...
atoms in the universe.
More than the number of atoms in the universe, right? So when he says it's based off probabilistic reasoning, that's not even a serious objection because the size of those probabilities is so big, you'd have to be crazy not to think that that's true.
Okay, so tell me this.
Yeah.
Since you're saying let's go by probabilities, the first point which I want to highlight here is earlier you were speaking about it being a fact, it being true, and now at least we've evolved in the sense that we're now speaking about a probabilistic framework and we're speaking about assumptions.
It doesn't mean
Well,
everything.
So now let's go to disputes.
No. Okay,
The fact
hang
that
on,
things are
hang on.
probabilistic doesn't mean
So
everything.
probabilistic does not mean it's not a fact.
I didn't interrupt you for almost like 5 minutes.
I'm sorry.
So let me just deal with some points. So the first point is this. Earlier in the conversation, and we have the video here, you weren't speaking about actual probabilities. You were saying it's true, overwhelming evidence, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now we've got to a point where you're now speaking about a probabilistic framework and you are admitting homology, because when you're speaking about look at this and look at this and look, therefore it's similar, you are basically accepting homology as an assumption within that. Now, when you take a particular quote and you say, look, you have this particular sequence and you have this particular sequence, and the chances of these sequences being converging randomly is this. I want to ask you some questions about this because I'm pretty sure you are clueless about this. What's the null hypothesis here?
The null hypothesis would be the amino acid sequences would be randomly distributed. So for example,
Here's the point. And this just goes to show how ignorant people like him are. Null hypothesis is that you will have randomness. Why the hell would you have that as a null hypothesis? Because anything is better than that. Anything.
what are you talking about, Suboor?
Wait, hang on a second. Your null hypothesis, if it's randomness, and you have something which is similar, anything is going to be better than this.
Okay,
all right, you're not getting it.
Okay, no. The null hypothesis here. Okay, so the hypothesis is that humans and chimps will have a more similar amino acid sequence than humans and dogs, and humans and dogs will have a more similar amino acid sequences than humans and fish. And humans and fish will have a more similar amino acid sequence than humans and yeast, which is what we observe.
Which is
right?
why.
Now the null hypothesis is that there's no relationship.
You've spoken for quite a while. Let me speak now. So wait. Let's not speak about dogs and fish. Let's stick to the initial point, which is about the null hypothesis being random.
Yeah.
Okay? I want you to tell me, firstly, this. Why is it random, first point? Secondly, when it comes to two things being anatomically similar, which idiot would come up with an idea that their genetics would not also be similar, rather than being random?
Okay, all right. First question first, right?
What kind of a thinking is that? That chimp looks similar anatomically to that human compared to those two birds. So I'm going to assume anatomically they're similar, but the null hypothesis, when I'm using the assumption of homology, is that this one
Okay.
is going to be random.
You haven't
That makes
understood the point at all,
absolutely no point.
Sabor,
That made any sense at all.
you haven't understood the point at all.
One person at a time.
Okay, you haven't understood the point. Right, okay. So let's suppose you look at humans, you look at chimps, and you say they're anatomically similar. So you might say, okay, that might lead me to the hypothesis that they share common ancestry, more recent common ancestry than humans and dogs, right? Then you look at things like the amino acid functional redundancies, and you see, does the data confirm the hypothesis or disconfirm the hypothesis? Now, Suboor asked what about randomness. If it's the case, there's no reason, if evolution is false, why the relationships couldn't be entirely random. There's no reason for those amino acid sequences to be highly similar if evolution is false.
They look similar, so why wouldn't they be?
Well, if
Because
God
you've
made-
missed,
if
that's
God
where you've
made
missed the whole
everything-
point. Amino acid, I tell you,
Calm down.
you didn't understand at all, right? Because if you change the amino acid sequence, you get the same functional protein. That's why, Suboor. That is the whole point. And that is why the leading scientists in the field say this is spectacular evidence. Okay? Sorry, right?
You can
So
agree with
they
him, but
say-
it doesn't
right,
add.
okay.
Look, truth is not based on consensus, yeah? Let me just make
No,
a...
hang on, hang on, hang on.
It is in
Let me,
science.
no, I want to
You're
address
wrong
one
about
other
that.
point that you made. I want to address another point.
Okay,
you
wait,
made.
hang on. Science, wait, look.
Okay,
I,
can I just-
I have something talking on the right. Wait, 1 second, yeah? Let me just...
Someone. Let's not call him a thing. Someone. That would be nice.
Well, actually, according to your worldview, it's all matter anyway, so it doesn't
But
matter.
that doesn't mean that we're not people. Okay?
No,
we
people
don't have to
identity makes no
depersonalise
sense under
people.
I'm a
atheism.
machine.
Okay.
I'm happy with that.
He's happy with that.
Okay, fine. If he's happy, okay. Let me address the point you said about probabilities.
Wait, hang on.
Being facts.
Hang on, I'm
No,
addressing your
if you
point.
made that point, I haven't had a chance to respond.
Okay, sure.
Okay?
But-
he said, right, that it's not a fact because it's probabilistic. That is a ludicrous thing to say, and he's contradicting himself. He's contradicting himself. Let me give you a quote that Suboor actually said on his video. Okay? He said on his video about hidden assumptions. Right, let me see if I can dig up the quote. Hang on a sec. Let's find it here. Right, let's get the quote. Right, he said, now he gives an example of a crime being committed at a criminal TV show, and he says this. He says, finally, near the end of the show, they discovered the crucial piece of information that was missing. They have DNA of the intruder who broke into the house and committed the murder, right? Program over. We know for certain that the person committed the murder because we have the key piece of information. That is the level of certainty that Darwinists want us to have when it comes to human-chimp ancestry. Like it's a done deal, guys. So that's a direct quote from Suboor. Okay? Right, now,
Wait, hang on.
let me finish the point.
I agree with that.
Let me finish the point, please.
But why does that
Let me
point
finish the point.
undermine what I've said?
Let me finish the point. I'll tell you why it does. Because when you get DNA evidence on a crime, what actually happens is they give you what's called the match probability. It's probabilistic. They say the chances of the DNA matching and the criteria in forensics is 1 in a billion. They say, okay, if it's 1 in a billion or more, then it's a match. The DNA is that person.
Sure, but what's the null hypothesis
So it's still probabilistic. It's still probabilistic. You can't say because it's probabilistic it's not a fact. Okay? This is what happens in all of science. So if Suboor's going to reject evolution, he has to reject pretty much all of science.
Hang
so
on.
hang on, let me finish.
I never said I reject evolution.
Right. You reject human-chimp common
No,
ancestry.
yes,
you
I do.
Right?
But I don't reject
So-
evolution. There's a
But
difference.
that's not the point we're debating, Suboor, is it?
No, but you said I reject evolution, which I don't.
Well, you reject human-chimp common ancestry. That is the point, right? And you said that it's a problem that it's based on probabilistic reasoning.
You do understand.
Right? But in science in general, this is what we do. When the Higgs was discovered, they said, okay, we've got 5 sigma certainty. What does that mean? It means that when we collect the data, we say the chances of that data happening by pure chance are 1 in 3.5 million. That's what 5 sigma means. And that in physics is considered a discovery. We've done it, right? We've got enough data. There's all of knowledge, all of human knowledge has uncertainty about it, right? All of human knowledge. So whether it's a philosophical argument, whether it's physical theory, whatever, there's always some certain level of uncertainty. In a criminal trial, you don't ask someone to be proven beyond all doubt, but beyond all reasonable doubt, and they're different.
Sure.
Because you get to a point where the level of uncertainty, whilst not zero, is so low that it'd be completely and utterly unreasonable not to follow through on the evidence that you have. And if you get a probability like something like 1 times 10 to the power 93, the level of uncertainty on that is so low that you call it a fact. That's the right thing to do.
Okay, so
That's what atheists do.
wait 1 second. If I make up a hypothesis, which is this, I'm going to walk down that road, and when I'm going to walk down that road, hypothesis that I have is that what's the probability of me being hit by lightning in comparison to another null hypothesis? And the null hypothesis is the hypothesis that as I'm walking down that road, I get mugged by Lady Gaga, then Madonna comes and gives me a punch in the face, then birds come and pluck at me and they fly away. According to that ridiculous null hypothesis, the probability of me being hit by lightning is very, very high. So what Phil's done here is a very fantastic thing, which is this. He said that this probability is so improbable that this is going to be the result. He didn't tell us the null hypothesis. So I said to him, what's the null hypothesis? He said random. And then I asked him a follow-up question. If two things look similar, why would you assume that when you look at their genetics, there's going to be randomness as a null hypothesis? So those probabilities that he's coming up with are meaningless. 2, when it comes to his earlier point that he made about Elliot Sober is a philosopher of biology, and he admits, like all philosophers of biology admit, and maybe Phil, he's supposed to have some sort of contact with scientists, maybe you can bring to me a philosopher of science or an evolutionary biologist who is willing to say, because he's going to be 1 in a million, who's willing to say scientists don't begin off with the assumption of homology, or that science doesn't begin with a hypothesis, which it actually does. Now, what Phil believes, and this is his deeply held belief, that prior to Darwin, and even up till recently, before we had genetics, all we had was human-chimp similarity, right? Just them looking anatomically similar. Genetics did something amazing. That's what he believes. Now, I want to ask Phil.
It's not just genetics, it's also the fossil record as well.
Fine, but we've only spoken about genetics now. Now, Phil, I want to ask him in front of everyone. Does he believe genetics changed the conversation on homology?
Well, what I believe is that genetics gave us, as the paper in Nature said, spectacular confirmation of human-chimp common ancestry. That's not me speaking, that is the Chimpanzee Genome Consortium speaking. That was
based on the assumption of homology,
Suboor,
based on the null hypothesis of randomness.
Okay, what are you talking about?
When you look at similarities...
It's based off of the evidence. That's what you fail to understand.
And evidence...
What Suboor is trying to say is that we start off with an assumption of homology and that's all we got. No.
Yep.
No. What we have is testable hypotheses, falsifiable hypotheses, right? That we then go and collect the data, and then the data will either falsify that assumption or confirm it.
Okay.
And what the data does is spectacularally confirm it.
Like in human ant similarity, like in human pig similarity, like in human
because
crow
if you start,
similarity.
let's suppose this. Let's suppose you thought, and I don't agree that humans and ants are the most similar sociologically. I don't agree with that, right? But let's suppose
they are.
Let's suppose it's true. Let's suppose it's true. Okay. Then what we can do, we can look for other supporting evidence to see, is it true that humans and ants share the most recent common ancestor? We can look at other forms of evidence.
Using the assumption
right?
of homology.
We can look at other forms of evidence and test it. So we could look at the genetics between humans and ants and see, does it come back confirming that hypothesis or disconfirming it?
Okay.
Right? And what it would do is disconfirm it. Right? And also we can look at the fossil evidence.
Okay.
That would also disconfirm
let's stick to
it.
genetics,
And we
that's
can
what
look
you
at
got. Forget
biogeography.
fossil.
Why
we can
should we
deal with all that
forget?
later. What piece of evidence can challenge the assumption of homology in genetics? I want you to give me any piece of evidence.
Easy.
Go on.
Easy. Right? if the amino acid sequences between species did not follow evolutionary phylogenetic branchings, then that would disprove it.
But hang on, that's assuming that similarities is due to common ancestry.
No, it isn't.
So what's it assuming?
Okay, it's assuming that if there are common ancestry,
Homology.
then
He just says, he says there's no assumption, then he says he assumes.
No, I'm saying, okay, if I misspoke, I'll correct myself, okay? Here is what we do. We look at data and see, can it confirm a particular hypothesis, right? Or is the null hypothesis confirmed? And in every case...
And the null hypothesis is randomness.
Right? Yeah, so what?
Which is just as likely as me walking down there and getting punched by Lady Gaga and birds coming and eating me away.
No, Suboor,
that's
where
random.
You've misunderstood it. That's where you've misunderstood it, okay? You've completely got things
What
upside
I want
down.
to know is,
Suboor,
when you gave us that...
Let me respond, right? Sure. Okay. What you're saying is that if you look at the amino acid sequences, what are you saying? They have to be similar?
No.
Then what? What are you saying about the amino
okay,
acid sequences?
let me put up my problem with what you were saying earlier.
Okay.
You were saying, look at this sequence, look at this sequence. The chances of this sequence being this similar based on the null hypothesis of randomness is this number, and that number may be 0.0000001%, which is more than the number of atoms in the universe, or whatever. What I'm saying is, why didn't you initially point out what the null hypothesis was when you were giving us that piece?
What difference does it make?
One second, I'm dealing with it. The difference it makes is that you're telling us the entire story. You're not just giving us a part of the story. And then when I asked you, why the hell would someone make an assumption of a null hypothesis being randomness, you haven't given a good enough answer. When we actually have good anecdotal evidence that, if anything, the genetics should be similar because the anatomy is similar.
No, that's completely wrong. You've totally misunderstood. It's nothing to do with the similarity in the anatomy. This is the battery. Okay, hang on 1 second. Right, this is what Suboor just fundamentally doesn't understand about this argument. Right, it's nothing to do with the anatomy. Right, what we've proven is that you can have a completely different amino acid sequence and the same functional protein. This is the whole point. It does not... what he's saying is, oh look, humans and chimps have got similar anatomy, so of course they've got similar amino acid sequences. And that's just wrong.
Why?
Right? I'll tell you why. Because if you take out the amino acid sequence, if you take out the protein from, let's say, yeast, right, and put the human protein in there, the function of the cytochrome C is unchanged. So you can have any amino acid sequence you like, right, and you will still have the same functional protein. Therefore, right, it doesn't mean you can't conclude that the amino acid sequences would be similar based off anatomy. You cannot conclude that. That is false.
No, that's
right?
not true.
It is completely and utterly
no,
false.
it's not,
right?
Okay, so let me explain why you're wrong here. When somebody is making a comparison between two different types of, say, sequences.
Yeah.
Now, if two things look similar, then why would somebody make the null hypothesis randomness unless you wanted to reconfirm what you already knew? Now, the issue here is this. Everything we've spoken about so far is based upon genetics. You believe genetics is decisive evidence for human-chimp ancestry, yes or no?
Yeah, I believe that, and so does the authors of the chimpanzee sequence paper, not just me, right?
Sure, fine.
Right, this
okay,
is what,
okay,
this
fine,
is,
fine.
This is a broad consensus
Fine.
in science. In fact,
Fine, one
Suboor,
second.
let me challenge you. Can you show me any papers in a journal as similarly high impact as Nature that say humans and chimps don't share a common ancestor? Can you quote me even one paper?
I already told you, based on the assumption of homology, that is a hypothesis. That is an.
Paper?
Wait, hang on.
Which paper was it?
Okay, wait, relax. We got time. You know.
I don't. I have to go in about 20 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. No problem. You've been refuted enough, but I'm going to make one last point.
refuted at all. Zero refutation.
Okay, wait 1 second. Let me refute both of you at the same time because he's been talking a lot. Let me ask you a question. all this time he's been speaking about genetics. And I've been bringing him back to the idea of homology, and that genetics adds nothing new to the assumption of homology, and nothing new to the evidence of human chimp ancestry being true literally, because this is a philosophical problem, not a scientific problem which can be resolved by data.
Used evidence is clear evidence.
Right? All he's been speaking about is genetics. Now I want to ask him one particular question. Do you think genetics has added anything new to the philosophical paradox of homology and homoplasy?
What I think is that the genetic evidence confirms homologous relationships between humans and chimps.
Okay, let me ask again because he didn't answer. At the time of Erasmus Darwin believed in human primate ancestry based on the assumption of homology. So did John Baptiste Lamarck. So did the ancient Hindu philosophers based on the assumption of homology. Genetics has added nothing new to this conversation. You say rubbish, what do you say?
I would say that it's not what I say. I'm
Your
nobody.
interpretation of what
I'm
they say.
nobody, okay?
I know that.
Right? Okay, thanks. Okay, who is not nobody is the Chimpanzee Genome Consortium. They are not nobody, they are the top experts in this field, okay? And it's not just one author, this is a consortium of all the leading genomic institutes in the world.
And
what they say is that the genetic evidence spectacularly confirms common ancestry. Right, now you said it's all about genetics,
wait.
so I'm going to give you some fossil evidence.
Wait, one second. No, we're not going to move on from that point.
Why not?
They are saying this is evidence based upon their assumption of homology.
No, it's based
If
on
the
the
null
data.
hypothesis is randomness, like you admitted, which is a self-confirming theory.
Isn't.
Right.
If you
that's it.
by definition, if you've got a null hypothesis and a hypothesis, and they're different data,
Null
then by
hypothesis is
definition
right.
it's not self-confirming, is it? Because you've got a null hypothesis.
Yeah, but if the null hypothesis
so that makes no sense at all.
if the null hypothesis
That doesn't make any sense at all.
If the null hypothesis is absolutely ridiculous, like me walking down there and getting mugged by Lady Gaga and birds eating
but
away
it
at me,
isn't ridiculous.
anything in comparison is going to be highly likely in probability. Now,
You say it's ridiculous
Now,
because you
what I
don't
want to do-
understand anything at all about
okay,
genetics.
now, here's the thing. All this time, Phil has been bringing up the idea of genetics.
All right,
And-
I'll switch to fossils.
And we will.
Fine.
Okay, before we go to fossils, let me put the final nail in his coffin.
There's no nail in anybody's coffin except your own. Continue.
Okay. Jonathan Marks, who is an atheist evolutionary biologist, this is his book, What It Means to Be a 98% Chimpanzee. Other species appear to grieve, but none weep as humans do, and certainly not over imaginary events like those in Les Miserables or Love Story. What does genetics have to say about all of this? Nothing, full stop. Sameness, otherness, is a philosophical paradox that is not resolved by argument. That is resolved by argument, not by data. Genetic data tells us precisely what we already knew, that humans are both similar and very different from the great apes. The exact same point I've been making all this time, except I wanted to bring out the quote right at the end when he's dug himself in a very dark, deep place. Genetics adds nothing new to the ancient paradox of similarity and dissimilarity.
Okay, there's nothing in what he quoted, nothing at all, that gives any evidence against human-chimp common ancestry. What that author is saying is that humans and chimps have differences. No one's disputing that. So that is what that is what we call a straw man.
Hang on.
Suboor, I didn't interrupt you there.
I am going to interrupt you because you have very little time and I want to make sure you refute it well enough.
Okay.
Wait, one
You are
second.
misquoting. He never
Hang on a
said-
second. We have a good crowd here. How many people think that this guy understood what that quote actually said?
Oh, I thought you said it wasn't decided by popularity vote.
Okay, it's not, but according to your friend, it is. So I'm going to go with your friend.
Well, he's not my friend. I've never met him before.
Well, he's supporting you. You should be his friend. That means you're supporting.
Okay,
Wait,
so
one second.
You're distracting.
One
this is a pure distraction.
Okay, wait, one second.
We don't decide things.
Wait, one
by
second.
how
One
people
second.
vote
One
here.
second.
Okay?
I gave him a very direct quote, which is this whole time Phil is speaking about genetics as if genetics has added anything new to the ancient problem of homology and homoplasy, to the ancient paradox. And he dug himself a deep hole by repeatedly speaking about genetics. And in that quote, Jonathan Marks basically says, genetics adds nothing new to this philosophical paradox, which is resolved by argument, not by genetic data. And what does he go on to say? He says, yeah, of course, he's saying we are different to great apes. That's not what the quote says.
The
problem is this. The quote says this very clearly. And the thing is, Phil comes to the park regularly. I come to the park regularly. We're filming this. The quote, if you want to say I quote mined, no problem. Go and research it and find me how I quote mined it, how I took it out of its context. But very clearly it says this. Homology, homoplasy, the philosophical paradox which existed before Darwin is not resolved by genetics, it's resolved by argument. So genetics adds, according to Jonathan Marks, an atheist evolutionary biologist, nothing new.
Okay, so what he's completely misquoting it, right? Because
Okay, wait, hang on a second. If I'm misquoting it, what did I quote? One second.
Look, sorry, can I respond?
Wait.
Sabor, let me respond. I didn't interrupt you. Sabor, I didn't interrupt you.
Relax.
Sabor, I didn't interrupt you. Let me respond.
Relax.
If you're not going to let me respond,
Relax.
we can end this now.
Listen, he's not your friend, but he's defending you a lot.
Sorry, can I respond?
No. 1 second. No,
I
1
can't
second.
respond, I
You
leave.
can respond, but first you said, I misquoted him. I'm asking you, what was the quote? Were you even listening?
Yeah, of course, I was listening.
Go on, what's the quote?
What you said was that humans and chimps are different, right? That they have significant dissimilarities. Okay? That's what the quote basically said, right? And that has nothing to do with the question.
Was
in
that
hand.
the quote?
That was nothing
That
to
was
do
not
with
the quote.
question in hand. Right.
Okay,
Sabor,
you seem like
let
an
me finish.
an objective object over here. So tell us this, was that what I said?
I was listening to the last section because it's too I've stopped listening about 2 minutes ago.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, can I?
No, wait,
Sabor,
1 second.
Let me finish. If you're going
One second.
if you're not going to let me finish, I'm going to walk away.
Okay, okay. When someone loses, they want to walk away, so I'm going to let him finish. Go on, talk.
Okay, fine. Right. Okay. How similar or dissimilar humans and chimps are is not the question for the debate. So he quotes this guy, Jonathan Marks, right? And he says, oh, humans do this, chimps don't do that. That's completely and utterly irrelevant to the question of whether humans and chimps share a common ancestor. No one is claiming that humans and chimps are identical. That is not the claim. So Sabor's argument is a total and utter straw man. The question is, do humans and chimps share a common ancestor? Not, are humans and chimps identical? Or how different are humans and chimps in terms of their behaviours? We are not claiming humans and chimps are identical. We are not claiming that the genetic evidence tells us exactly how similar we are to chimps in terms of our behaviours. No. What we're saying the genetic evidence does is tell us that humans and chimps share a common ancestor. And I've asked him for even one paper in a high-impact journal like Nature that I quoted that says the opposite conclusion. And he cannot quote even one. Not
what
even
conclusion?
one. Right?
What conclusion?
That humans and chimps share a common ancestor.
No, they all have that conclusion based upon the assumption of homology.
It's based off of the data.
And the data is looked at basing...
So have you got any data that goes the other way?
Have
you got any data that goes the other way?
Hang on 1 second. For the data to go the other way, I need a rival null hypothesis. But the null hypothesis which you gave is that of randomness. Anything is going to be better than randomness.
So
now,
give me another
1 second,
way.
one second.
Give me some data. Give
Now
me a
what?
paper.
Hang
Give me a paper.
But
that
I didn't
says
give you a paper. I gave you an evolutionary biologist who's describing the way the field works.
Which you misquoted.
Okay, if I misquoted him, then tell me this. What book did I misquote him from?
Elliot Sober was Evolution.
No, the book is What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee.
Okay.
Right?
Fine.
You even got the book wrong. Now let me...
No, that was a different quote.
Yes, so you weren't listening.
No,
we moved on since that
you've
point.
done so many misquotes, Suboor. It's hard to know which one you were
And
asking about.
wait, for you to say I've misquoted, you need to give evidence. But here's the point. What atheists do is this. You misquoted. But what they do themselves is look at this amazing piece of evidence. Look at this amazing piece of evidence. And when I ask him, what's the null hypothesis? It's randomness. Hang on a second. If you're going to give us evidence, which is supposed to be conclusive, you are misquoting when you don't give the entire story, when you don't explain what the null hypothesis is, and whether that null hypothesis is actually justified. Now, what he said, what Jonathan Marks said, is that I'm misquoting him, but he himself has never read that book. And
Actually, I have read that book.
You've read this book?
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me, in this book, what does Jonathan Marks say genetics has done to the conversation about homology?
Okay, it's a long time since I read that book, but my recollection was that what he was saying was that the difference between humans and chimps is more than simply the 1 or 2% quoted, 98% similar or 99% similar or 96%. That actually, that what created the difference between humans and chimps was regulatory changes in the growth factors in humans, human neocortex.
Okay,
right?
you haven't read the book, have you?
I have.
Okay, so read this part.
Okay, fine. Okay. Other species appear to be... Okay, we've read this already.
Wait, read it.
Okay. Other species appear to agree, but none we as humans do. And certainly not imaginary events like those in Les Miserables or Love. What does genetics have to say about all this? Nothing. Right?
Nothing.
But that's not the question. That is not the question, Suboor. You're quoting this completely out of context.
Wait, carry on. Finish the quote. Finish the quote.
Okay. Sameness otherness is a philosophical paradox resolved by argument, not by data. Genetic data tells precisely what we already knew. The humans' apes are very similar to different from great apes. But that's completely irrelevant.
And that's what I've been saying for the last 2 hours.
Suboor, right, I've got to respond to this. Sure. Right? Because what he's saying is, how similar are humans and chimps? Do they have emotions? Do they weep at Les Miserables? That is not the question that we're asking. Humans and chimps could be very, very different at an emotional level, right? We in evolution, what we say is that humans have a brain that's, say, 1400 cc's. Chimps is only about, 300, 400 cc's. So what there was a very large increase in the neocortex of the human, right?
Did anyone hear that in the quote?
And that quote captures the whole book, does it, Suboor?
No, it doesn't, and you clearly haven't read it, so you don't know what the other parts are. So here's the thing.
Does he say
wait, 1 second.
that humans and chimps differed because of acceleration in the growth factors of the neocortex genes, yes or no?
I can't think of that.
Maybe he said that.
Maybe he said it. Okay, but even if he does say that, that's irrelevant to this point. The point I'm making here is I let Phil speak about genetics, and here you have an evolutionary biologist saying the philosophical paradox is not resolved by genetic data, and sameness, otherness is a philosophical paradox that is not resolved, that's resolved by argument, not by data. Genetic data tells us precisely what we already knew, that humans are both similar and very different to great apes.
But not about the question of common ancestry,
genetics doesn't add anything different to what Erasmus Darwin, which I began off with, which is Darwin's grandfather, believed, which is homology. It does nothing different. Now move on to fossils if you want.
All right, fine. Okay, so I just want to respond, because whether humans and chimps, how similar they are in terms of their emotions and so on, I agree that genetics doesn't tell us that. That's a difficult question.
Sure.
But it does tell us about humans and chimp common ancestry. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to...
I'm not running out of time.
I know, but I am.
Didn't you ask for this debate?
Yes.
And you took we took a few weeks for it to get arranged. You wanted to do it in a university, right? We're here in the park. Right. So now you're claiming I'm misquoting. So what you need to do is, if you're going to make those claims, you need to substantiate them, or else you're going to look like a fool walking away right now.
I did substantiate.
You didn't.
Yes, okay. You want me to say the same thing again?
No, You didn't
Right?
substantiate anything. You only
I
spoke
did.
about genetics, and I just showed you genetics
No, you
is
said- okay.
not resolve. It doesn't resolve the
okay,
ancient problem of homoplasy and
No, no, no,
homology.
okay.
Go
Well,
to
we've
fossils.
got- okay, fine.
We need to go through all of them.
Okay, fine. Let's go on to this. Okay. So if evolution is true, okay, if we find hominid fossils, we should find fossils that have transitional forms. Okay, and we do. So for example, as I said, chimpanzee brain is about 300 or 400 cc's, and if we look at the human brain, it's about 1400 cc's. Okay. So if we look at hominid fossils, what we should find is that the brain size is gradually increasing over time. So let me show you. So basically, if evolution is true, then we should have an upward sloping graph for brain size versus time. Okay? And that is precisely what we find. Let me give you a graph of the data. Just pull it up, give me a second. Here it is. Okay, here's a detailed version of the data. What you see is that the earliest hominid fossils have quite small brains, and very gradually it's going up. So if evolution is true, we should see this upward sloping graph going to the right, increasing brain size over time. That's exactly what we see. And there's another way to look at it called a civilization protein, which is the brain size as proportional to the body size. Okay? And here is a graph. You can see Australopithecus afarensis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, all gradually going upwards over time. Now, it's not just brain size. We have other things in our anatomy. So if you look at Australopithecus, okay, here's Australopithecus. The blue features are the features that Australopithecus has in common with humans. So, to give you an example, barrel-shaped rib cage, flexible lumbar region, short and broad pelvis, blah, 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 blah. Okay? The orange ones are what Australopithecus has in common with chimps. So it's got these features in common with chimps, and has features in common with humans. So just to give you an example, an intermediate, right? So to give you another example, not just brain size. So Australopithecus is an animal that had a human upright stance, but it had a chimpanzee-sized brain. Okay? There are other intermediate features in Australopithecus as well. So for example, chimpanzees walk like this, they do knuckle walking. So they have long arms for that. The arm ratio is 100% of the legs, roughly. Okay? Now, in humans it's about 70% because we don't do this knuckle. So our arms are not as long. Okay? Now, what's Australopithecus? Bang in the middle, 85% arm ratio to leg ratio. Okay? Bang in the middle. And there are many, many features. You can look at the teeth as well. They have reduced canines, intermediate between humans and chimps. So the fossil evidence, and also, we also have the location, okay? They're in sub-Saharan Africa. And the genetic evidence also points to the common ancestor. So the fossil evidence is very, very important.
It's just like there's someone
Exactly.
that
If evolution is true. So the reasonable thing to do is to conclude, based on the evidence, that evolution, human chimp common ancestry, is true.
Okay. So what you've mentioned there is still based on the assumption of homology. And even with that assumption, we still have recalcitrant facts. So I'll give you an example. You're speaking about the famous Lucy fossil and how it's supposed to be bipedal. It's supposed to have some evidence that it was actually walking on two. Now, we actually have, how old is Lucy? Something like 4 million years old or whatever.
It's about 3 million years old.
Fine, 3 million years old. Yeah. So we have apes which were fully bipedal in southern Italy about 10 million years ago, right? Those are not used as our sort of most recent common ancestor compared to something like Lucy. Now this is assuming...
So a bipedal ape in
bipedal
southern Italy.
in southern Italy,
Yeah.
yeah.
Give me a reference.
And, oh wait, hang on a second. He realizes it's a recalcitrant fact. So let me give you the evidence. If this bipedal ape does exist in southern Italy, which is 10 million years old, we have a recalcitrant fact, and I'm going to make 2 points before I give him the evidence for that. One, this still doesn't disprove human-chimp ancestry because of methodological naturalism, because of homology, and two, this recalcitrant fact is going to be explained using an ad hoc rationalization. Those 2 points.
Okay. You haven't addressed anything about transitional forms, have you? Why is it that we have this upward sloping graph in all the hominid fossils? Why, Suboor? Can you give me a reason? Sorry? No, it's not that we used to be a gorilla. That's a misunderstanding of evolution. Evolution doesn't say we used to be gorillas. What it says is that we share a common ancestry. Okay? That's not the same as saying we used to be gorillas. Okay?
Carry on, I'm just looking for the reference.
Yeah, go ahead. Okay, this is, okay, I mean, what more to say? This is the graph of hominid ancestors. Okay? You can see a clear pattern, a very clear pattern, upward sloping. Right? That's exactly what we'd expect.
But that's still based on the assumption of homology. I don't see how you're giving anything
saying
different.
this phrase like it's some sort of magic wand, based on the assumption of homology. You can assume whatever you like. The data is the data, right? And the data confirms the hypothesis.
Yes,
okay,
I
and
have cancer and I go for a test and I've got cancer. The assumption's nothing to do with it.
Wait, hang on.
Okay? Can you quote me a paper?
Okay, wait.
I've challenged you to quote me a paper in a high-impact journal like Nature or Science or whatever that says, no, we have clear evidence against human-chimp common ancestry. And you haven't quoted even one paper.
That's the point I actually made.
Even one.
Wait, that's the point I actually made. There is no piece of data which can go against that because, wait, hang on. You agreed with me. There is no piece of data which can go against that.
They can or does?
That can.
Well,
Nothing.
that's not true.
That's not true.
That's not true.
That's not true.
No, it is.
That's completely false.
It's actually true.
All right.
I'll tell you why it's true.
So how would it be?
One second. Let me answer, yeah? The book is Science and Human Origins. This is written by, these are Christian.
This is a book?
Yes.
Well, no, we want a scientific paper, Suboor, not a book.
Wait, hang on.
Anyone can publish anything in a book.
Phil,
That's
Phil,
not peer
Phil,
review.
Phil, Phil.
I want something in a
Phil.
proper journal.
Phil, 1 second. Phil, 1 second. 1 second.
Sorry, that's irrelevant.
I'm not dealing with this point. I'm dealing with the earlier point of the Italian ape.
Yeah, I want a reference in a proper peer-reviewed journal.
What, the existence of this ape?
And that it was in Italy, and that it's 10 million years old, and that it's bipedal. And I want it in a proper peer-reviewed journal, not in a book.
Hang on. Then I have to actually go to the page. All right,
Go
carry
wherever
on.
you need. Right, you can't find it. No surprise.
Well, wait, hang on a second. If I did find it, or if I didn't actually find it, it wouldn't make a difference to my overall argument which I'm actually making, and which you've admitted, that if there is this Italian ape, which is 10 million years old, which is fully bipedal, this is a recalcitrant fact. But this does not, and this reconfirms something I said earlier, this does not falsify human-chimp ancestry because nothing can.
Well, okay, he says nothing can falsify human-chimp common ancestry.
Because of methodological naturalism and homology.
Suboor, okay, all right, let me just address that point, right? First off, as we established, it's nothing to do with methodological naturalism, because we could have a perfectly naturalistic explanation for human origins that's nothing to do with evolution. You could be someone that believes in spontaneous creation, and people were. Aristotle believed in spontaneous creation. Many other ancient Greeks, I think it was Anaxagoras, believed in it. Okay, so it's nothing from naturalism that says that humans and chimps have to share a common ancestor. And human and chimps' common ancestry is falsifiable. Of course, any one piece of evidence, has to be taken in the context of all the evidence, right? So it's true that you have to look at all the evidence. Okay, multiple lines of evidence. If you just found one thing, of course, you have to look at the broad picture. Okay. Now,
I'm doing call a friend.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I mean, we've been going for 2 hours.
No, wait. I need to give you this reference first.
Okay.
Well, the ape was in Africa, I believe,
All right,
17 million years ago.
Point
so
is,
it happened
if it
before
were the case that we found that, going back to my original example,
Sam Rowe, how
that
you doing?
human,
Bro, I need a quick favour. Hello?
The nano
I need a
P8
quick favour.
pseudogene
You know that
is
Italian
the
ape
oldest
that
of
we
the
were speaking
pseudogenes
about, which was
that
discovered in
that
southern
would
Italy?
be falsified
What was it
human
called?
evolution, right? If we found that humans and chimps,
which was fully bipedal.
their amino acid sequence,
Can you WhatsApp me the name and
was
just
not
WhatsApp
more
me
similar
where they
to humans
like
and
some
yeast,
reference where they
that
discovered
would
it?
falsify evolution. If that graph,
I need it ASAP. Kind of debating an atheist right now.
if that graph didn't have that pattern, that would go against human evolution, right?
Okay, Phil.
Let me give you another test, right? If humans and chimps share a common ancestor, right, then what we should find is that the genetic diversity in human populations should be highest at the center of origin. This is called Vavilov's theory. This is widely accepted in genetics. The origin center is where you have the highest genetic diversity. So if we found, what we could look at different ethnicities, Europeans, Eskimos, Native Americans, Aboriginals, whoever, and if evolution is true, sub-Saharan Africans should have the highest genetic diversity. If it turned out that Eskimos had the highest genetic diversity, that would be evidence against human-chimp common ancestry. That would be evidence against human.
Wait.
Right?
Wait,
if
hang on.
Now, what
That's
it
a
turns
non
out-
sequitur.
No, it isn't
That's a total non sequitur.
How is it
You're
a non sequitur?
assuming, and this is a very racist thing, by the way, that East Africa is where you have the great apes, and that's where the black people are.
No,
so
that's where you have the fossils.
wait, hang on.
It's not racist at
It is
all.
racist, and I'll tell you why.
How is it racist?
I'll tell you why. Because we do actually have fossils which are also in other parts of Asia, such as China, which could also be interpreted as the beginning of human beings. Now, your argument is a non sequitur.
You're wrong.
Okay.
The oldest
hang on,
hominid
hang on,
fossils
wait,
are all
wait,
in
you
East
made
Africa.
your point. You made your
They're
point.
all
Let
in
me make-
Sub-Saharan Africa,
Wait,
and that's where
wait.
then we should find
No,
the highest genetic diversity.
the oldest fossil of recently that discovered of a human being is actually in Morocco, North
Of
Africa.
a human being?
Yes.
That's not what we're talking about.
Yes.
We're talking about the oldest hominid fossils, where Australopithecus is,
Yes.
where Orenin is,
yes,
where all these, there's nothing to do
No,
with
no,
where
but you're assuming-
the oldest modern human is. That's just
You're
ridiculous.
You're assuming those are human ancestors.
Well, no, if that's where human ancestry is, then we can confirm it with another piece of evidence. That's the point. This is what you completely
So give me-
misunderstand
okay,
every time.
so-
You say, oh, we're just assuming this, we're just assuming this, we're just assuming this.
Okay.
But the whole point is the data
Assumptions
can
don't
confirm or deny the assumptions.
Wait, hang on,
right?
hang on.
And the data overwhelmingly confirms it.
Okay,
This
Phil,
is the whole point.
Phil, here's the thing. The fossils which are found in East Africa, those fossils, none of them, and here's the point which I'm making, have been proven to be human ancestors. Those
totally
fossils.
misunderstand.
Wait, hang on a second. Every single one of those fossils that's been discovered, those discoveries are based on the assumption of homology, and the assumption which is actually made. And here's the point. Look, I'm going to make an argument. No. Sir, I'm debating one person at a time. I'll speak to you next. Lucy is assumed to be a human chimp ancestor. Is supposed to be our recent sort of, if you like, grandmother, because she was discovered in Africa, and she was supposed to be bipedal. Now, I want you to.
All the evidence says it's
Wait, hang on. Why didn't researchers use the ape which was discovered in southern Italy, which is 10 million years old, 7 million years older, as a human chimp ancestor?
You keep quoting this
because
you haven't given a reference point.
okay, wait, it's coming.
given
I actually
nothing.
rang a friend for it. One
I know,
second.
but you've
I
given
work
nothing,
with
right?
some researchers. Oh wait, it just came in. Good timing. It's called Australopithecus bambuli, and here it is. Journal of Human Evolution. So the point which I was making stands. If you look at any fossil, that fossil, you're using that fossil and you're basing it on an assumption of homology, and you're saying that this is a human chimp ancestor. But that assumption is not reconfirmed by you looking at similarities. Because that argument would be like this. That would be like, similarities are due to common descent. Similarities exist, therefore similarities are due to common descent. But that would actually be circular reasoning. Why didn't these researchers use the ape which was discovered in Italy, which was a fully bipedal ape, and use that as a human chimpanzee system, because Darwin and the people prior to him, they were actually racist, and they wanted to show that the black person is much closer to the other primates than the Caucasian people. So they didn't use the ape in southern Italy, which is 10 million years old, fully bipedal. Rather, they used an ape which was 3 million years old, 3 million years old, which was in southern Africa. And here's the point. When you believe a theory is true, anything is evidence. Darwin believed, and he said this in The Descent of Man, that African people, they actually, some of them, they have feet which are like this, which actually have opposable thumbs, which is why black people are good at climbing trees. Now, any black people here, sir, do you have any relatives in Africa who have feet which are like this? Do you know of any African which has feet like this? Now, why did Darwin describe these Africans who have feet like this? Because he has an idea in his head which he believes to be true, which is his actual theory. So because he believes it to be true, the evidence that he sees, anything could actually be evidence. Also, when Darwin went to South America, he did the same thing with the South Americans, because he believed the white race, the Caucasian race, was the highest. So when he described the Fujian people, he said these were people that used to grunt, they could hardly speak. Yet researchers, when they studied those same people around 30 years before Darwin, they said this is a sophisticated society which have a language of about 30,000 words. So Darwin, he already believed his theory to be true, so anything was actually evidence. Now, the last point which I want to make is this. Wait, hang on. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wasn't a racist. The Islamic civilization wasn't racist. You can't say Darwin.
So why did you have Islamic slavery? What was the justification for Islamic slavery in Africa? Right? Islamic slavery in Africa started before Europe.
Okay.
I need to respond.
So, right. Any fossil which he brings up is the same as the genetic evidence, the same as the anatomical evidence, is still based on the assumption of homology, which, by the way, and this thing Phil has not addressed at all. He has not addressed this point at all, which is homology is a necessary condition to establish human chimpanzee history. It's not sufficient. For it to even remotely be sufficient, you need a mechanism of natural selection or any other mechanism. And this whole time, he did not speak even the smallest amount about the mechanism. Without the mechanism, at best, all you have is a story.
Okay. Let me read you the paper that Suboor thinks is evidence of bipedal ape. This is what the paper he just gave me says.
No. I gave you the paper with the name of the actual fossil.
Results further show that the sacrum exhibits relatively small pseudogaphysial articular facet surface areas and mediolaterally narrow, also compared with modern humans, indicating that the morphology of Australopithecus sacrum is incompatible with the functional demands of habitual bipedal stance and locomotion. The oropithecal lumborsal region does not exhibit adaptations for habitual bipedal locomotion. So your own paper contradicts you.
No.
Yes, it does. Right, now hang on,
hang on,
and I didn't interrupt. I've got to respond.
Go on.
Okay, and we've got to wrap up because we've been here more than 2 hours. Okay, right.
I didn't. Wait. Hang on. This ape is.
I didn't interrupt you.
Wait. Hang on a second. Before you make your point, let me just make a simple point about this ape. No. This particular ape, it can walk on two, and it doesn't do that all the time. It also has locomotion. But Lucy was something which they think was transitioning towards actual bipedalism, or according to some, wait, hang on a second. According to some, according to some, it was fully bipedal. Whatever it actually is, the point which I was actually making is this: why would they go with something which is 4 million years old and not go with something which is 10 million years old? Because they had a previous theory of this, right? And even if there was no fossil evidence of any hominid, which is what you said earlier about Henry Gee. Even if there was no fossils, human-chimp ancestry would still be true, which is what you said earlier.
We have independent evidence from
No, you
genetics,
don't have independent
from
evidence because it's based
from
on the assumption of homology.
From embryology, that we have, yes, it would be true if we had no fossils. Because
Exactly, that's the point.
No, Suboor.
You just admitted the same point.
No, okay, so let me finish, right? Okay. The whole point is, yes, it would be true if we had no fossils.
There you go.
Sorry, can I finish without you interrupting?
So what's the... Okay, go on.
Okay, because we have multiple lines of evidence from independent fields of study. So if we didn't have any fossils, and there's no reason why we have to have fossils, it's very difficult for a fossil to form. It's very rare that a fossil ever is going to form. So there's no reason why we have to have fossils, okay? So if we didn't have any fossils, we've still got the genetics, we've still got the biogeography, we have other lines of evidence, and that's what Henry Gee was saying, right? But we do have the fossils. Now, he's saying that this thing can occasionally be bipedal. That's irrelevant. Lots of animals can occasionally go up on their feet, right? A meerkat can occasionally go up on its feet. But what is interesting to paleontology is whether you have an animal that actually predominantly walks on its feet. That's what you need a particular anatomy for. So you have something, the way the skull attaches to the rest of the body, that has to be a certain way if you're going to have consistent bipedal walking. And that's what Australopithecus has. And Australopithecus has these transitional forms. It has a spine, an attachment of the magnum, I forget the name, magnum something is the name of the attachment, and that attaches just like it's bipedal. But it also has features that are similar to chimpanzees because it has fingers and feet that are more flexible, so that it can climb trees as well. So that's the transitional forms that we have. Okay. Now he was talking about racism. I mean, saying Darwin was racist. Almost everyone in the 19th century.
That's not
racist,
true,
right?
That's not true. But I'll do. Sorry.
But it's irrelevant. It's completely and utterly irrelevant. The evidence that we share common ancestries with chimpanzees, there's nothing racist about that. The idea, we say that the genetic diversity is highest in Africans because the fossil evidence leads us to Africa. Okay? It's not saying anything bad about African people. There's nothing racist about that. Okay? All it's saying is that's where we find the fossils, so that's where we should find the genetic diversity. We have the hypothesis.
Well, why not the fossil in
data,
Italy?
Because it's not a bipedal ape, that's why. Okay, I'm done. I have to go.
Wait, you're not.
You can conclude.
Wait, hang on.
We've been here for more than 2 hours.
That's
enough time. I have to go.
Hang on. So the very beginning of the paper, which you didn't actually read, is this. The claim that Australopithecus practice habitual terrestrial bipedalism is partly based on restored postcranial remains originally recovered from this. Right.
Read the conclusions.
Hang on.
Read the conclusion.
Hang on 1 second. This same ape, there are some scientists who say it's bipedal, there are some who say it's not bipedal.
Find me a paper that says it was bipedal.
Okay, here.
No, that paper doesn't.
No, that paper doesn't, but this paper does. There is a difference of opinion about it. Now, if there is this particular ape, which is supposed to be bipedal, and this particular ape, according to this paper, was actually bipedal, this wouldn't make a difference to human-chimp ancestry being true or not being true. The same thing with Lucy. There is a whole, as you know, some discussion about did it actually walk in this way or did it actually walk in that way?
There's broad consensus Lucy was bipedal.
Okay, but
right, that's a fact.
even if she was bipedal, how does that prove human-chimp ancestry to be true?
Because, okay, what it does is it provides evidence of a transitional form, which is if we find fossil evidence of hominid species, they should have transitional properties. Australopithecus does have transitional properties, therefore it supports the hypothesis of common descent. And I have to leave it there.
Wait.
I'm sorry, we've been here for 2.5 hours.
Wait, hang on. 5 minutes more.
Okay, 5 minutes.
5 minutes more. The point you're actually making is there is a fossil, which we actually have, and this particular fossil, this is a human chimp ancestor.
No, I never said that.
Okay.
You're completely wrong.
Fine.
You're misquoting me.
Okay,
I
fine.
never said that.
Okay, fine. What do you
can't
think it is?
We can't say Australopithecus was our ancestor.
Fine.
Well, I don't
So what
claim
point are you
that.
making?
Because what we should find is overall patterns in the fossil record. Not that that particular specimen was our ancestor. We can't say that.
Okay, so fine.
Right?
Okay, so
I'm
fine.
not claiming
Okay,
that.
so what are we looking for?
We're looking for patterns in the fossil record that confirm the hypothesis of human-chimp common ancestry. So, for example, what we should find, if we plot out all of the many hominid fossils that we find, we should find that, for example, there are features that show a gradual change. So if we take at the size of the brain, for example, we plot out how big are the brains of all the different hominid fossils that we find. There should be an upward slope
That's not true.
going to the right.
That's not true.
Why is that
I'll
not
tell you why it's not true. And this is why I don't want you to run away, because you're making a lot of claims here.
Well, I can't say it forever, Suboor. We've been here for
No,
2.5 hours.
no. But you've been trying to escape for a while, and
I'm not trying
you're-
to escape.
you're-
I
wait.
am not trying to escape.
Relax.
We've been here for 2.5
Relax,
hours.
relax.
I've been on
Relax.
holiday, and my brother is here, and we said that we would go for tea after this.
Okay, that's fine. You can
Okay?
go for tea. You can go for tea. No, I'm not going to get in the way of
Okay.
your tea time.
Thank you. 2.5 hours is plenty of time.
What the problem is here is this. You want us to take the idea of human-chimp ancestry to be true literally, whether you look at genetics or you look at fossils or you look at something else. Now, a particular point that you actually made is that we should be seeing it getting bigger over time, right? Now, that is not the way that Darwinian evolution works. Darwinian evolution doesn't work by progression.
What do you mean it doesn't work by progression?
This idea, the old idea of the great chain of being,
But no one's claiming that's right. The
Yeah.
argument doesn't depend on that at all.
No,
Not
but
at all,
what
not
you're
even-
saying
not
is we
even
should.
slightly.
No, what you're saying is that we should be seeing it getting bigger over time.
Yes.
Why?
Because we have big brains and chimps don't. That's why.
No, but
I'm
no,
not saying
no,
big brain is
no.
better.
But then what you've
I'm
got,
just saying it's that
And
we
this
have
is-
it, they don't.
and this is the problem, Phil. This is the problem. This is why I want you to understand this point. Chimp, human,
Yep.
assuming common ancestry.
Yeah.
Similarities exist, therefore common ancestry is true. This is circular
No,
reasoning.
But we're not saying that. You've not listened to anything
Wait,
I
wait,
said.
hang on.
We're not saying it's because of similarities. We're not saying that.
Okay.
That is a complete, total
You
misunderstanding.
don't. Wait, 1 second. You don't agree because you don't understand what he's saying.
No, you don't understand
No. Hang
anything
on.
about the subjects.
Every single
really
time,
don't.
every single time you say this is not based on homology or this is not based on similarity. Yet, every single time you go to comparison, which is homology.
You don't understand what you're talking about.
Why
You
not?
really don't.
Why not?
I've explained it all for the last 2.5 hours. Why not, Suboor? To be honest,
You don't agree because you don't understand what you're saying.
Repeating myself endlessly is
Salman
Eh,
is fucking
Wait, hang on.
idiot.
Okay,
fucking bastard. He's
tell me
fucking
this.
idiot.
Tell me this.
It's fucking
Do you
idiot.
believe?
He's bastard.
Do you believe
Well,
Lucy,
swear
which
he's
you were speaking
bastard.
about earlier?
Yeah.
Do you believe Lucy is a
Forget,
ancestor of me and you?
Right, this is why I feel like
He's idiot.
we're going around in circles. I have already answered that question.
Fucking Mohammed
Did
bin
you not
Salman.
listen to what I said?
I was
Fucking
listening.
Mohammed
What did I
bin
say?
Salman.
Sorry?
Fucking
did I
Saudi
say?
Arabia.
1 second. Are you drunk? You were saying that this
Fucking
particular.
Mohammed bin Salman.
I'm not,
Fucking Saudi Arabia.
I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to
The
you.
idiot.
I'm not talking to you.
Well, swear the idiot.
I'm not talking to you. Can you just go away?
Fucking Mohammed bin Salman.
When it comes to this entire conversation,
Sorry, I answered your question. What was the answer that I gave you? Let's just check that you were listening to me.
I was being shouted at from the
No,
left.
this
So,
was before he shouted. I answered that before he.
so what did
turned
he
up.
say? Repeat it.
Right, so you didn't listen to what I was saying, correct?
I was trying to listen, but he said
No,
something.
he wasn't here.
Okay, so
Don't-
what was it? I'll hear it again. What was
Okay,
it?
you asked me whether I thought Australopithecus was our ancestor. Okay, and I said we can't conclude that.
Perfect, which is
Right.
what I was saying.
No, but that's irrelevant, Suboor.
No, it's not irrelevant.
It is irrelevant.
Why is it irrelevant?
This is why we're going round and round in circles. Because what I said was that if evolution is true, there are certain patterns that we should find in the overall data from the fossil record. Not that you can pick any one data point and say, that's the ancestor. You can't do that.
Okay.
But what you can do is look at the whole data. I'll give an analogy from physics here, right? So when you do, in quantum mechanics, you do something called a double split experiment. You fire a beam of electrons through two splits, and what you get, what quantum mechanics says you should get, is an interference pattern. Now, quantum mechanics cannot predict where any individual electron will go. It cannot say anything about the individual electron. But what it can say is the overall pattern will be an interference pattern. So similarly, in paleontology, you can't look at a specimen like Lucy and say, that's the ancestor. I mean, some people have said that, and I don't think that they should.
Perfect.
Right? But what you can do is say the overall pattern of the data should look like this. If evolution is true, it should look like this. And it does look like that.
Correct.
And therefore, it supports the hypothesis.
Okay,
And
wait,
that's it.
okay.
And that's it.
So here's the problem.
And you can sum up, and then
No.
we've had our extra 5 minutes.
Okay, wait, hang
I'm
on.
going to go. Okay?
Wait, hang on. What you're saying here is basically this. When it came to genetics, you were using that as evidence, and we concluded that that did not add anything new to the...
We didn't conclude that. You concluded that. The
Okay,
actual
that's what-
professional scientists in the field conclude the opposite.
No, wait.
Yes, they do.
Wait,
I'm going to have to get this
wait,
back
wait.
out. I'm going to have to get this back out.
You can get the stuff out all you want. Let me just make my point. When it comes to actually homology, and it comes to genetics, and it comes to anatomy, or it comes to the fossil record, all of this is based on the assumption of homology. And there is nothing new that is added to this by genetics or by the fossil record. Now here's the actual point. The point is that no fossil can be proven to be a human chimp ancestor.
But you don't need that. I already accepted that. You're not listening to anything I'm saying. You're not listening to anything I'm saying.
Wait, hang on. Even if there was no fossils, human chimp ancestry would still be believed to be true by you.
Because we have other evidence.
No.
Because we have other
No,
evidence.
but at the moment what's happening, Phil, is this. It's like whack-a-mole. You deal with something with genetics, and you show how that's not an independent line of reasoning, you run off to the fossils. When you deal with that, you run off with something else. So tell me this.
What you're saying, running off to something else, means providing independent evidence.
No, but hang on.
You're
How
saying-
can that be independent evidence? When I dealt with genetics, you ran away to
You
the fossil
didn't
record,
deal with genetics.
and when we're dealing with the fossil record, you're running off to we have other independent evidence. The
You
thing is,
didn't deal with any of them.
yes, I did.
All right, you think you did. You assess you won the debate.
No,
I'll assess I
Phil,
won the debate.
Phil.
And we'll have to let the people that watch decide.
No.
Okay?
Phil, for you to come here, you actually wanted to have a formal debate. We have to.
Yeah. And how long would the formal debate be? Tell me.
I don't know however long the
2 or 3
Q&A
hours,
is.
something like that, right?
Something like this, yeah.
We've been here for 2
So-
hours.
so tell me this.
2.5
So
hours,
tell me this,
right?
tell me this.
And we're going round
Tell
and
me this.
round and round in circles.
Tell me this. Tell me if my summary of you is wrong. You began off with it's true. It is actually true. And I began off with it is an assumption of homology which cannot be disproven. And this is still based on methodological naturalism, still based on the idea that even if homology was true, it would be a necessary condition for human chimp ancestry, not a sufficient one, because you still have to have a mechanism of natural selection which you didn't deal with. In our conversation, it devolved to a point where you admitted the assumption is there, but what you're still trying to do is you're still trying to say the assumption is validated based on probabilities.
Okay, what I said was that human and chimp common ancestry is a fact, and it's a fact because the data overwhelmingly supports it. And that's not just me saying that. This is what the Chimpanzee Genome Consortium said in their paper. Sorry, can you
I know what you're saying.
So why do
No.
philosophers of science and philosophers of biology and
You are
evolutionary biologists?
misquoting those philosophers. Elliot Sober, you quoted him as saying that you can't infer common ancestry from similarities.
That's not what he says there.
Yes, it is what
He says you can't say it's a must, it's true.
Right, it's, okay, I agree with him. It's not. It's
And
not,
that's the point I was making.
No, Suboor, you're not. not must be true because of an assumption of common ancestry. The whole point I'm saying is you don't conclude it because of your assumption of homology, right? You do it because the data confirms it.
And I summarize your argument. I summarize your argument, which was similarities are due to common ancestry. Similarities exist. Therefore, common ancestry is true. And this is circular reasoning, which you've been doing throughout this 2 hours.
We're going to have to finish it. Thank you very much.
Saudi Arabia.
But you do realise your original point, you devolved from it.
Suboor, we've discussed it for 2.5 hours. People can watch the discussion and then they can make their own. Okay?
They can do, but I want you to understand something, right?
Suboor, look, we're going over the same thing again and again. And again. We're going to leave it here. Okay?
Do you think your position has actually changed? Because your position in the beginning and the end was different.
No, it hasn't. You've just misunderstood it. You've misunderstood it. That's all it is.
Okay.
That's all it is.
Okay, but here's the thing. When we have these,
it's not a circular argument.
It is
because you're saying we start with an assumption of homology and therefore we conclude homology. Now, a circular argument is that there's no way out of the circle, right? But in here we have the data, and the data can either confirm or deny the hypothesis, right? And it confirms it, and that's why it's not a circular argument, because the data can easily refute it. And that's what you don't understand.
The data cannot refute it.
Well, we'll have to disagree.
Because, as we pointed out, and you disagreed with this, we have sociological evidence, which is different. We also have the fact that even genetically, that we have some things in the human and chimp genome which are different, but nothing.
But the evidence,
nothing can actually
says the genes are going to be identical. That's a stupid thing to say.
No, it's not.
Because no one is saying the human genome and the chimp genome are identical. So the fact that there are some differences is completely irrelevant.
Exactly.
Irrelevant.
Exactly, because nothing can disconfirm the assumption of homology.
Not true.
So why doesn't
I would give you multiple things that could disconfirm it.
Go on.
Okay. One, nano-PA pseudogene is the oldest of the pseudogenes. If that were true, that would be disconfirming evidence of human chimp combination.
Okay, why? Let's deal with that. Why?
Why? Because nano-PA is not in the chimps.
Okay.
Right? Nano P1, P2, P3, P4, all the way nano P11, they're all in the chimps.
Okay, perfect.
Now, if they're in the chimps.
Wait.
Okay, this is getting dangerous.
Okay, just one last thing.
No. We've had many last things.
Okay, no, but
we're going to have to give it up.
Just one last point.
Yo.
Wait, Phil, one last point. Phil.
No, my brother's safety is more important.
Yeah, whoa.
Phil, the point that you're making is that if there's a dissimilarity, that's disconfirmation. And I gave you dissimilarity from a sociological perspective. I gave you dissimilarity in terms of intelligence perspective, but this doesn't actually challenge human chimp ancestry. Phil, you didn't make your point. You made a circular argument the whole time.
2.5 hours.
You just made the same circular argument again and again.
I'm not going to have anyone in here. I'm going to have a People can watch the video.
We can discuss this again too. The fact of the matter is this. All throughout this conversation, you first did not want to acknowledge homology was an assumption. Then you acknowledged it as an assumption. Then you believed it could be verified. So in summary, what I began off with, you still haven't challenged, which is similarities is due to common descent. Similarities exist, therefore similarities is due to common descent. This at best is circular reasoning. And I don't see why you're walking away, because you wanted to have this debate.
We have had the debate.
No, but Phil, the debate. No, relax, Phil. When we wanted to have this discussion, you wanted to have a formal discussion. You said you had more credentials than Aaron Ra, which I don't know how you managed to make that conclusion.
I never said that. No, you lied. You said I only debate people that have professional qualifications in the field.
Yep.
And I pointed out Aaron Ra doesn't have those qualifications.
He does.
No, he doesn't.
He studied paleontology.
He has not got any postgraduate degrees in this subject.
Wait,
How
hang
do
on,
I
hang
know?
on, hang on.
Because I asked him. Me and Anna
Okay, so
had a conversation, and I
have you
asked
studied paleontology?
him, have I? No.
What have you studied in terms of evolutionary biology?
I'm not qualified in evolution.
So where Aaron Ra is, because he studied paleontology.
He is, well,
He's more qualified than you.
I asked him if he had professional qualifications in evolutionary biology, and he told me no.
It says on his Wikipedia page he studied paleontology.
I asked him, and he said no.
And he's been debating this topic for about 30 years now.
Right, so.
No, but your
If
point,
it was me versus you, this would be really interesting. But it isn't.
it's you misrepresenting the scientific community.
It's you versus a whole scientific.
No, it's not.
It is.
Because which scientist, can you bring me one scientist or scientific paper or a philosopher of science or philosopher of biology who says homology is not an assumption you begin off with? Nobody.
The question is not what are the starting assumptions. The question is what does the.
Ah, you agree their starting assumptions are there?
I've already told you. Right? The point is the evidence confirms the image.
If the evidence is based on an assumption and the null hypothesis is something ridiculous, and genetics adds nothing new to the conversation.
Okay. You're misquoting it. The genetics, what he was saying was that the genetics adds nothing new to the issue of how similar humans and chimps are.
That's not what he said.
That's not the question.
That's not what he said.
The question is,
You're misquoting him.
The question is,
The whole
are
time
humans and chimps
you're misquoting him.
got a common ancestor? Totally different question.
You're misquoting him.
I'm
Totally.
going to finish it here, okay? You've got to put a line under it, okay?